So unless you've been sleeping under a rock, you'd know that Christopher Nolan is soon to be making his return to the big screen, with Oppenheimer releasing in just a few days. From what I've heard, every journalist who has seen it seems to love it, and many are saying that it could be one of his best. So I thought with all the hype going around on the internet, I would try to cash in on it and rank all 11 Christopher Nolan movies. In at number 11 we have Following. Following was Nolan's debut film, so naturally you would expect him to get better as time goes on. This film was made on a minuscule budget when compared to his other work, and according to Nolan, filming took place with his friends one day every week for a few weeks' time. The film itself is a solid noir which in a non-linear timeline follows a writer who likes to observe and take notes on people from a distance, who slowly gets caught up in a life of crime. Not to mention it has a few well done twists along the way that will definitely catch you off guard like it did to me. It definitely is constrained by its budget, which is why it doesn't try to do too much other than just tell a fine story, but it definitely doesn't underachieve with what it does offer. I don't really know what else to say than it's just a solid debut film. At number 10 we have Insomnia. Insomnia was made right after Memento, and for me it is a bit of a step down. Don't get me wrong, Al Pacino and Robin Williams definitely both carry their weight, and the cold Alaskan setting really works for me, but not much else does. Insomnia is a detective film which doesn't really have a mystery to it. You're introduced to the case, and then shortly after you're introduced to the killer. Most of the plot doesn't follow the hunt to find the murderer it sets up, but instead follows Al Pacino's character after he makes a mistake on the job and attempts to cover it up. There are definitely a good few scenes in here, one notable one being the interrogation scene, which definitely lays the groundwork for what Nolan will do with an interrogation scene in The Dark Knight. Next up we have Tenet, which is arguably Nolan's most ambitious film to date. However, the higher you aim to be, the harder you will fall if not everything works out, which I think is the case for this movie. For a movie that wants to do so much, it causes a lot to get left behind. For example, because it focuses so much on spectacle, characters the spectacle is happening around seem less fleshed out than they could be. I feel like Dunkirk faces a similar issue, yet it isn't as big of a problem as it is here. The movie definitely does not slow down to make sure the audience fully understands all the reversing time elements, and if you get it at the start then you should be fine, but if you don't then you're probably going to go the rest of the 2.5 hour runtime just as confused to what's going on, which also really doesn't help when the music in the background is often played at a lot louder volume than what's actually happening in the scene with the dialogue. In at number 8 we have The Dark Knight Rises, which is an interesting one for me because I really like the ending and how it ties up the whole Dark Knight trilogy nicely, but the rest of the movie I'm just not as big a fan of. Now part of this is due to Heath Ledger unfortunately passing away, who probably would have had a decent role to play in this movie, but instead he was replaced by Tom Hardy as Bane, who does a good job of what he was given, but that's just not really a whole lot. The movie starts with Bruce working to get back to his full fitness and escape the pit he is stuck in, which just goes on for a little bit too long. And although I love Joseph Gordon-Levitt, I don't think he is at his best here, and don't get me started on the pointless Robin twist at the end. I know I've said a lot of negative about this, but I also still do like it. I just think it had the impossible job of following up probably the best superhero movie of all time, and I don't think it was ever going to be as great as the one that came before it. But at the same time, I was still a little bit disappointed with what we ended up getting. Coming in at number 7 we have Dunkirk. This is the part of the list where ranking these films becomes extra difficult because from here on out all of these movies are amazing. But I have Dunkirk up this low because, like I mentioned earlier, most of the characters don't really have a lot going on. In fact, in this movie there's barely any dialogue, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but I think in a movie of this scale and such a grand war, it needs characters to sort of ground you and navigate you through the story that's being told. Instead of this, we get 3 different timelines, all with different characters inside of them. And because of how quick it chops and changes between all 3 of them, it's hard to connect to any of them. And although the 3 different timelines can be off-putting at first, I feel like once it all comes together at the end, it starts to make sense, and ultimately leads to one of the best war movie third acts. To put it simply, Batman Begins is one of, if not the greatest superhero origin story ever to be put to film. It introduces Christian Bale, who is both great as Bruce Wayne and Batman. Liam Neeson's great in it, and so is Cillian Murphy as Scarecrow, who doesn't get talked about nearly as much as he should. One of my favourite things about this later gets undone in The Dark Knight, and that's the look of Gotham City itself. This one it's like a lot darker and mystical, and in the sequels they got rid of it and just used aerial shots of Chicago, which kind of takes away the uniqueness Gotham City had. Alright, I know this next one is going to make some people upset. Let me just say I do not dislike Inception. It's not even close to that. I just have to place it somewhere on this list, and I feel like I like it the least out of all of the next movies. Everyone says that it's Nolan's most confusing movie, but I wouldn't say it's confusing. The plot itself is actually a fairly simple heist story. Break into Cillian Murphy's mind, implant the idea of him ending his father's empire, and then get out safely. I would say it's more layered than it is confusing. Unlike Tenet, which I feel like relies more on its visual spectacle, I think Inception's story and visuals go hand in hand. The story needs its visual spectacle to tell itself in the way it does, and the visuals need its story to be as good as it is, so it justifies being as flamboyant as they are. I feel like DiCaprio's character is good, as well as Elliot Page, but outside of those two, I think they're fairly surface level, and I think it's probably the least rewatchable out of the next 4 movies I have ahead of this one. The Prestige is probably the most underrated film on this list. It stars Christian Bale and Hugh Jackman as they essentially try to out-magician one another throughout the course of the film, as the pair of them slowly grow more and more insane and try to perform more intense tricks. I feel like this is some of the best character work Nolan has done in his career, with both lead characters having their own backgrounds and reasons for you to root for them. Characters you start out liking in this, you may end up hating, and vice versa. I do want to refrain from spoilers, but what I will say is it kind of loses its footing once they add Nikola Tesla into the film. Specifically one of his projects that he's working on, which kind of takes away from the realistic magic the movie had been going for up until then. But ultimately, it sort of becomes a red herring for the final twist in the film, which is one of the greatest twists out there. At number 3 we have Memento, which in my opinion is one of the greatest detective movies ever made. It was made not long after Following came out, and it's clear how that movie and some of its style sort of bled into this one, but improved on it greatly. It follows Guy Pearce as Leonard as he tries to track down the killer of his wife, which you might think just sounds like a generic thriller, but this is a Nolan movie, there has to be some sort of twist, and there is. Leonard suffers from short-term memory loss, meaning that it's a detective story about someone with no memory. The film has 2 different timelines, which are separated in black and white shots and shots in colour. The shots in colour tell the story backwards, and the black and white goes forwards, which means the climax of this movie is where the 2 meet into the middle. Everything this movie tries to do, it succeeds with flying colours, and I just don't see how you can get better from here. Oh yeah, we still have Interstellar. I feel like for whatever reason, people have decided to sort of flip their opinion on Interstellar. When it came out, people were praising it so highly that a lot of people nowadays are starting to think that's a bit overrated, but I don't see that at all. This movie's great. I mean, just look at it. Keep looking. And then look some more. Interstellar at its core is a story about a family, and it uses time and space as a means to tell that story. Matthew McConaughey brings home a performance of a lifetime. Matt Damon is just as evil as you'd want him to be, and the whole cast pulls their weight in such an emotional ride. The movie is almost 3 hours long, but feels like 2 because of how well paced it is. I haven't even mentioned the score, which to me is Hans Zimmer's magnum opus. Oh, and quick side note, since when was Timothée Chalamet in this movie? I've seen it so many times and I've just found that out on my most recent viewing. First place, we obviously have Dark Knight. Now I feel like this is the most predictable result on this list. I mean, what can you praise about this movie that hasn't been said a million times already? Heath Ledger brings an Oscar-winning performance, which forever redefined what it means to play a supervillain. Aaron Eckhart is so underrated as Harvey Dent and Two-Face, I genuinely feel bad for him and how he was overshadowed. The music goes off, the action is great, with a large emphasis on practical effects over CGI. The opening scene is one of the best there is, and there just isn't much else to say other than it's as close to perfection as you are going to get from a Batman movie. But once again, all of these are just my opinion, and now that you've got to this point, I'll be so grateful if you were to leave a like, subscribe, and comment down below your lists in the comments.